Our topic tonight, as all of you know, is Iran's grand strategy for the future. They were sort of underlying the long-range implication. And as everyone knows, we're witnessing a huge American effort with respect to nuclear weaponry, which is a piece, an important piece to be sure, of a much larger set of questions which involve Iran and the future of the Middle East and the future of American foreign policy. And it's that breadth of view over the long run of Iran and how the Middle East may play out in part with respect to Iran and our interests there that will be addressed this evening. And we're really grateful to our speaker for joining us. Professor Sullivan is at the Naval Defense University, or the National Defense University. He also is an adjunct professor at Georgetown in security studies. He's an Irishman who went to Brandeis, Junior Phi Beta Kappa, and graduated with the highest honors from that institution. I couldn't resist asking him why he went there, and he had an interest in theater. And Brandeis has a wonderful program in that. He ended up, of course, developing an interest in a somewhat different direction. His master's, Master of Arts degree, his Master of Philosophy degree, and his Ph.D., all from Yale, were in economics. And he's had a marvelous career in which he's, I think the center of gravity correctly can be stated as interest in natural resources, energy questions, water questions, resources in general. But in the course of doing this, he's dealt with a variety of issues. The things that he's written about are diverse, extensive, but in his view, all related to one another. And among these things are a lot of political topics which are of major interest to us. He has written about Iran, of course, taken a good hard look at it. He is, I think, a genuine expert on the Middle East. He taught at the American University, Cairo, for 6 years. He's lived and traveled extensively in the area for a couple of decades. He currently still is writing a column for the Times of Ulaanbaatar and in Mongolia. So his interests have stretched from the Far East. In fact, his dissertation was on Japan and India, and he's recently given a lecture on the nuclear problems in Japan. But in any case, his interests have stretched across the world from the North Africa to Australia. They've involved Latin America, on which he gave a lecture just recently, and Japan as well. So he's written in by my count, well over 50 different journals. He's been quoted in the media on 5 continents and many more than just 50. So he's written about topics of a great variety with a center of gravity on international energy questions, to be sure, and has published widely. He's briefed widely in the government. He's testified before the congressional hearings. He's immersed himself, in short, in the Middle East. He's taken very seriously the questions of Iran, and I think we're extraordinarily fortunate to have him join us this evening. It's my great pleasure, on behalf of all of you, to welcome Dr. Paul Sullivan.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invite. It's good to be in Baltimore. It's been a long time since I was here last. Before I give any public lecture, I have to give the following caveat. The opinions I express are mine alone, do not represent those of the U.S. government, Georgetown, or any other organization I might be associated with. So now I can get myself into trouble. You might notice that I'm not exactly in sync with some of our policies, whatever those policies might be. I am not a Republican, nor am I a Democrat. They have both failed us. Excuse me. What I see in Washington is dysfunctionality and kneecapping and careerism at all levels. People are not focusing on the country and our national security, which should be the objective of everyone in this country. And if you're in a position of intellectual and other leadership, you should focus on the goal, and that is the national security of this country and international security in general, which directly affects us. We also need to take a bigger picture, not the next election, not the next money cycle. What, the next presidential election will be $3 billion maybe? Think of what a $500 million would do for Baltimore. How about that? How much did we spend on the last two major wars? Well, according to two notable Harvard professors, how does $3 trillion sound to you? Trillion with a T. And we have accomplished what? There is a debate out there that either we agree with the deal, I'm sure you've heard this, or you must be for war. I'm for neither. I want to find a middle way. I've been part of war games looking at what might happen if we get into war with Iran. I usually sleep pretty well. 3 days without sleep did not help my attitude at home, my children tell me. This war game went on for 3 days, and the costs that could come to the world would be enormous. I'll just throw one of them out. How does $350 a barrel oil sound to you? How does $25 a gallon of gasoline sound to you? That's one of the scenarios. How does invading a country that thinks of itself as being a country that has been in existence for the last 6,000 years with a deep culture, and as soon as one American boot lands on the ground, all hell breaks loose? A country that is 5 times the population of Iraq's, in a much more complicated topology. There are mountains. There are swamps. There's a huge, vast salt desert in the center of Iran. And we will definitely not be invited in. There's also an argument that we could take out all these nuclear facilities with just a few sorties. Those of you who don't know, sorties are you put a young man or woman inside of an aircraft and you send them halfway across the world to take out a nuclear system in a country that has anti-aircraft batteries all over the place. The estimate I saw was 10,000 sorties. The nuclear facilities are all over the map in Iran. It's not just one nuclear facility in Iraq, as the Israelis took out in 1980. This is a very complicated situation. Frankly, I am fed up with the selfishness of Washington. The political selfishness, the money selfishness that has walked us into the hells that we have been in. How many of you know people who have been in tours in Iraq and Afghanistan? Raise your hands. How many of you have relatives? How many of you have seen the damage? How many of you are ready for another one? That's the argument that's being used to back down to a bad deal. A bad deal that is based on technology, not behavior. We'll get into that. We need a grand strategy. We don't have one. We don't even have a strategy. So what's a grand strategy? It's way beyond the pablum of political documents that pose as a strategy. Excuse the alliteration, it just sounded good last night. And the short-run point scoring of the profane sides of politics. And politics are almost by definition profane when it involves the loss of life and limb and happiness of younger people and their families, here and in the places that we think we can topple so easily. I can tell you right now, toppling Iran will be far more difficult than Iraq. And did we topple anything? No, actually, what we toppled is the credibility of the United States. Am I blunt? Am I blunt enough? Should I be more blunt? I can do that later on. So a grand strategy. This is what we teach at the National Defense University, what we teach students at Georgetown, at Annapolis right down the road. They're taught all about what is grand strategy, the grand vision of a country. You need to bring everything together to protect the country and direct it toward prosperity, peace, and a better future. That grand strategy is both internal and external. It's economic, meaning you need power economically to keep your military forces going ahead. Now, let's twist this a little bit. Economic power for the Iranians in their grand strategy. We are going to hand it to them as soon as this deal goes through. The sanctions will be taken off piece by piece on a deal that is short run, and it doesn't even deal with their behavior in the region or overseas. Iran is number 2 in the world for natural gas conventional reserves. What does that mean? That means trillions of dollars. It is number 4 or 5 in conventional oil reserves in the world. We open that market up, European money, Asian money, and American money. Actually, American oil companies are on their way to talk with the Iranians. What does that make me feel like? Not happy. Not only that, this is going to change economically the structure of most of the pipeline systems and energy systems in the Caspian area going all the way to Russia, and the sources of gas and oil going to Europe and to Asia, to Pakistan and to India. The amount of money that could pour into Iran once this thing is opened up will be stunning. Also, Iran can connect its electricity systems in with the Caspian and other trading systems in with the Caspian. Iran needs a lot of investment in industrial development. Now, am I against the development of the Iranian people? No. Am I against the Iranian people? No. Do I want to see them impoverished? No. I would love to see them free of the oppression that they must face. One of the major human rights activists, a lady, in Iran was arrested 2 days ago as the negotiations were going on, as side meetings in UN on the non-proliferation treaty were occurring. That's economic oppression, because without money you cannot do that. With a lot of money you can buy a lot of equipment and do a lot of things, not only in your region but globally. Economic growth in Iran is going to be a good thing for the Iranian people, but it is intent and behavior of their leadership that I am concerned about. If they were all very nice people in their leadership, I think this would not be a problem. Most of you are probably familiar with Mr. Rouhani, kind of the smiling, moderate fellow. He always seems to be very chipper and diplomatic. Actually, he is, although he was something of a thug back in 1999. He runs almost nothing in the country. The man who runs everything is Ayatollah Khamenei. He runs the secret police. He runs the Basij. He runs the IGRC, the Republican Guard. He runs most of the activities, kinetic intelligence activities, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, and in Bahrain. This is the person who will make the decision on this deal. And recently he's been sending out signals, oh, maybe I like it, maybe I don't like it. Who are we dealing with? That's a good question. That's a very good question. How can on one hand we say, let's make a deal on nuclear technology, and then at the same time try to stop them from continuing delivering weapons to Yemeni rebels who are attacking other Yemenis in a civil war, and then claim that they're doing nothing. I have a former student who was living in Sana'a until a few weeks ago, and he said he's never seen anything like it. He's in his 40s. He wasn't so worried about it. He's tough. His 4-year-old daughter would shake every day when the bombs landed. We're talking about people here. This is grand strategy, but grand strategy is about people too. Political. Now we open up the door for more political activities by the Iranians worldwide. We no longer sanction what they can do in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa. They become more politically powerful. They become more diplomatically powerful. How many of you know that the Venezuelans have been handing off Venezuelan passports to Iranians for years? And that Iran is very much involved in Bolivia. It has some leverage in Brazil. Now you see why I deal in all different parts of the world. You want to understand something, you have to trace the steps. Follow the money, follow the power, follow the egregious behavior. Iran is becoming more powerful in Africa, even during the sanctions. South Africa in particular. China is the #1 market for Iranian oil. 60% of their exports go to China. By the way, you're all aware that we have oil sanctions against Iran? And that if any country invests more than, I think, $20 million, then we're supposed to shut them down here? Guess what? It's never happened. Chinese companies are here. The Chinese run 2 of the largest oil fields in Iran right now. And they're buying their oil. They built a trolley system in Tehran, road systems, railways, clinics, and so forth. And these are sanctions? Anyone remember Al D'Amato? Goes way back to that. Goes way back to Al D'Amato. The Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, which has been applied infrequently and weakly. What really stung the Iranians recently was being thrown out of something called the SWIFT system. That's whereby you can exchange money and pay bills across country through certain banking organizations. Once you can't do that, you're going to have to figure out another way of doing things. Have they figured out another way of doing things? Yes. Gold and food for oil. There was a whole bunch of gold leaving Turkey a couple of years ago. People are looking at this. What's going on here? The Turks were sending gold to Iran to get oil and natural gas. Isn't that something? Right under our noses. They are the #2 market for Iranian oil and natural gas. Turkey. All right, political power. Political power is unimportant, right? You're going around the world, you control part of the UN, you get the votes, throw money around. Where does that leave us? Why are we negotiating from weakness as the greatest country on earth? Can I be blunt enough? What's our economy compared to Iran's economy? If you took the economy of Washington, D.C. all the way up to Baltimore, that's the Iranian economy. The rest of it, well, that's us. So who is kidding whom here? All right. Informational. Anyone ever heard of the Cyber Corps? Oh, right down the road. You know about those guys, right? Never say anything, no such agency. The Iranians have something similar, and they're building that. The more they're opened up to more money and more skills and more training, the more likely they're going to be able to build that even further. Information warfare is the start of the next war. Cyber. It's not going to be just missiles. It's going to be taking out things through computer systems. Anyone ever have your computer hacked? Okay, let's see, half the hands go up, but you don't want to tell everyone it happened to you, right? Can you really work after that's happened? No. Now think of a military system that's just been hacked, or a financial system that's just been hacked. This is part of the war too, and part of the problem with that is you can't tell where it's coming from. The Saudi hack, everyone says it's the North Koreans, and I don't know. Who knows where it came from? Diplomatic, they're building diplomatic power as I speak. Are we? Are we? Where do we fit into the world in relative power terms compared to before the Iraq War, compared to before the Afghan War? A lot less. A mentor of mine, an older gentleman, when I was a younger man, once turned to me and said, "Paul, you want to keep your power, you know what you do? You never use it. Because if you ever use it, they'll know what you don't have." We used a lot of power, a lot of weapons, and look what happened. ISIS, Yemen, Syria, the breakdown of Iraq, disturbances in Bahrain, eastern Saudi Arabia, where most of the oil in Saudi Arabia can be found, being disturbed by the Iranians. So there are many dimensions of this grand strategy of theirs. And if we just look at a single technology of centrifuges, you know, when I first heard about this deal, I saw the 2-page document coming out of the White House. Did anyone want to take a look at that? You really want a shocker. Look at the 2-pagers explaining what this alleged deal is all about. By the way, it's not a deal. Any people in business, you ever do a deal without signing anything? This is a framework for discussing a deal. You do not move into a house when you talk to the owner and say, "I have a framework to discuss this." Yes, excuse me if I get sarcastic every once in a while. Remember, I'm from Boston. I can get away with that stuff. All right, economic power can beget military power. We know that from our own history. Tomorrow is the anniversary of what? VE Day. How did we win that war? Through economic power and industrialization. Anyone else could do it. There's no secret to that. Military power can beget economic power by leveraging people who have something that you want, or to open up pipeline routes. Diplomatic power can establish good economic treaties. This is a good and bad. Both of these are yin and yang. Opportunity, crisis, same thing. The relaxation and abrogation of sanctions and other economic restrictions is happening through diplomatic power. They don't have to shoot a single bullet, and they're going to have this happen. How many of you know that they have a mock-up of an American aircraft carrier right off the shores of Iran, which a couple of months ago they bombed? And they brought it out a couple of days ago to think about bombing it again. Does this strike you as a group of people who are diplomatic and friendly and looking for soft power? No, the problem is we're looking at the soft power side of Iran, which there is. The hard power of Iran is still there. Iran is not really one country. It has many different leaderships, many different people making decisions. And if it looks contradictory, because it is. It's almost as contradictory as Washington. Imagine trying to figure out what the Democrats and the Republicans are doing if you're an Iranian. Say, what? You must be kidding. They said this, and then they said this, and then you know, the thing was voted in that now our Congress, our senators, and our House of Representatives can now look at the document. Oh, thank you. Because once they take a deep look at this thing, they'll probably be as baffled as I've been. The first day I saw this thing, I was pacing in my house saying, what's the point? I don't get the point. Bahrain. Bahrain is an interesting small country where we have the 5th Fleet. Very important place for us. The Iranians have been playing games there for the last 20 years. And the so-called democratic insurgency of Bahrain since 2010 was Iranian-sponsored. Does that sound like a peaceful maneuver? What's the end goal here? When you have a grand strategy, you want to have some kind of goal, right? Anyone ever heard of the Sassanian Empire? The Sassanids? Look that up when you get home. Google it. I'm sure some of you are already Googling it. It extended all the way to Egypt, along the west coast of the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen, east coast of the Arabian Peninsula, all the way into Pakistan and India, up into Central Asia, and as far as the Balkans. That was a previous Iranian empire. Are they looking to restore this? Not necessarily, because I think they have a little bit more common sense. And also, they won't spend $3 trillion like we did. They don't have it. Their GDP isn't even that. But they're going to be expanding their territory. You look at intent. Words are words. I think you've all been around and you've seen that. Anyone can say anything. It's the intent and the behavior that really gives it away. What have they been doing in Lebanon since the 1970s? Hezbollah. What were some of the leadership statements with regard to Israel? That wasn't exactly warm and friendly, now was it? Even the Egyptians are worried of them. There's actually a law in Egypt against proselytizing Shia faith, which gets back to a big part of what's going on here. I was in one of our embassies in the Gulf a few years ago speaking with one of our defense attachés, and I just mentioned him over a cup of coffee outside. Nice, sunny, beastly hot day. It's the Gulf in June. And I said, the Sunni-Shia tensions will be the explosion of the future. And he looked at me baffled. What is that all about? It's what's been happening. It's what's happening in Iraq. It's why Mr. Maliki was essentially pushed out of the way, because it got worse. It's what helped establish ISIS, which I don't call the Islamic State of anything, because it has nothing to do with it. I call them sociopaths and psychopaths in Syria and Iraq. And if there are any psychologists in the room, do a little study of them, you'll probably find out that it gets pretty close to that. Where did they come from? They were so bad, Al-Qaeda threw them out. Think of the worst gang in the worst part of any city in this country, and that gang throwing out the worst people in the gang, and then the next gang throwing out those really bad guys. This is what we're dealing with. Syria is a nightmare. It's also a sectarian nightmare. If you've been around the Middle East enough and you listen to someone's name, you know what they are and even what neighborhood they're from. And that could make them a target. Names in Iraq mean a lot. There was ethnic cleansing in Iraq. When Saddam Hussein was in charge, guess what? Didn't happen. Anyone remember Tito? In the Balkans, what happened after Tito died? The Balkans fell apart. Ethnic differences fell apart. Excuse me, but I'm all for democracy, but in some places you need a tough guy to keep things in line. Once that tough guy goes, because there was a great leader in another part of the world that figured it was time to change regime, look what happened. Now I'm going after the Republicans. How about that? Was that really well thought out? Do I even have to ask that question? Anyone familiar with the yellow cake from Niger? Oh, everyone's going, yeah, this is good. I like this. And the ambassador and his wife, who shouldn't have been talked about but was, but the guy who talked about her didn't even go to prison. How about that one, huh? By the way, that note that was sent via the P2 Lodge in Rome, which is an interesting lodge, had the wrong prime minister of Niger's name on it. It had bad French, and by the way, Niger cannot make yellow cake. It's called doing your homework. If you're not familiar with this document was actually presented in Congress as one of the arguments that Iraq was going to build a bomb. When I talk to my students, younger students and older students, I tell them all the time, if you're in a position of speaking truth to power, do it. Do not back down. Because people who back down help bring us this. It's joint and culpable liability. Lawyers in the room, you know what that means. By being quiet and silent and not battling for the truth, you walked into it. Now, the goals and objectives of the people of Iran are probably the same as people here. Regular folks in Iran. Prosperity, good education for the kids, food on the table, a little bit of equality. Iran is very unequal, by the way. It is a mafiocracy. The United States is unequal, too. I think we saw a little bit of a reaction to that here last week. In 2009, there was an attempt at a reaction in Iran, and it was crushed. Now, they do a Google on the Green Revolution 2009 and what the Basij did with the motorbikes to push kids back away from thinking about a better future. We're going to allow this to happen again by allowing them to become rich before they change their behavior? Excuse me if I'm a hardliner. Most people think of me as a kind of middle-of-the-road, moderate kind of fellow. And I think of myself as that too. But when I see an obvious threat, both externally and internally, I cannot keep quiet. If you have a wonderful leader who has pretty much a monopoly on information, you can bring your people along. That's pretty much what we're seeing. And when we help by opening up these sanctions, and actually they think they're going to be written off right after this deal is signed, let me tell you, it's not going to happen. Because we have sanctions that are presidential directives, that will happen. That are laws, that won't happen. They have to be repealed. That are UN related, that are EU related, that are internationally related, that are going to take a long time. There will be people in Congress who will take this to court. And of course, as usual, the lawyers will win. But that will be important. That will be important. If and when this is taken off, how much time do they have before this whole thing ends? 10 years. 10 years to an American? Wow, that's a long time, 10 years. Think about the last time the Red Sox won. To an Iranian culture, 10 years is that. 6,000 years compared to 10 years. I'll wait it out. And then when this deal is over, I'm going to have a few $100 billion in the bank. I'm going to have freedom of movement. I'm going to be developing the South Pars natural gas field, which is one of the largest natural gas fields in the world. I will have LNG export technology to send that stuff to China and Europe and Japan and South Korea. I will develop further my oil fields. I'm waiting out the 10 years. Listen to me. I'm waiting out the 10 years and I'm doing all kinds of things. I'm building industry. I'm building my military industry. There's nothing in this deal that says anything about ballistic missiles. Nothing. There's nothing in this deal that says anything about modernizing the Iranian military. Nothing. There's nothing in this deal that says anything about changing the behavior of Iran except on the number of centrifuges and what a certain facility called Fordo can do. Fordo is essentially a place where fissile material is created. They have been told to shut it down and turn it into an atomic research laboratory. Doesn't that sound nice? I understand there's at least one physicist in the room. How long would it take to change a fissile material factory into an atomic research laboratory? Typically, university, that could take decades. But they're supposed to do it overnight, and then we just sign off the sanctions. Does this sound like an Ionescu play? Anyone familiar with Ionescu, the theater of the absurd? Going back to my theater days, where it just doesn't make any sense, but at the end of it, oh, you know, that made sense. This makes no sense. All right, I'm sure the administration's not too happy about it, but whatever. So they're in Bahrain, they're in eastern Saudi Arabia, they're in Yemen, they're in Latin America, they're in Africa. Are there forces of moderation that can come up out of the ranks as Iran develops when the sanctions are taken off? We've been living with that strategy of hope long enough. Strategy involves strategy, not positive thinking. I like to have my feet on the ground. Anyone been in the military? Yeah, hope has a lot to do with it. If you don't have hope when you go into the battlefield, you're not going to last. But you have to have a strategy and tactics that work, that contain, that change behavior, that move the world to a better position. We have leverage globally in China, in Russia, in Europe, Latin America, well, we kind of wrecked that a few years ago, in Africa and elsewhere. Sometimes the best strategies are indirect, behind the scenes. Have proxies put the pressure on. Think creatively. And by the way, don't have CNN in the room with you. Because as soon as the strategy becomes public, oh, there's something wrong with this. Oh, there's really something wrong with this. No, we can't do that. And then the debate proceeds. Some of the best meetings I've been in are track 2 meetings. Track 2 meetings are very quiet meetings with some of the big players trying to figure out what the better policies might be. No press. You sign a document saying you don't say a word. And you work it through. You have a nice dinner. Everyone's kind of frozen until the dinner happens. And then you start talking with the Chinese, the Europeans, the Russians, everyone in that room as people wanting to find a solution. And then you go back and you report. Sometimes we can learn from being quiet and subtle. Chinese do this very well. We do it badly. Whenever we do something, we want Hollywood with us. So Iran has survived in a difficult environment. To give you some idea of the Shia-Sunni differences. There are about 150 million Shia, thereabouts. We're not really sure. I don't think they've been real polls lately. Could you imagine doing a poll in Syria or in Iran? There are about 1.3 billion Sunnis. A billion with a B. Iran often thinks of itself as the leader and protector of that 150 million. Most of them are in Iran, in the region of the Middle East. That gives it religious, sectarian clout. And in the Middle East, the more you learn about it, the more you realize that the calls to religious clout are often a veil for something else. And we've fallen into that trap. They're extremists and our extremists feed off each other and make it worse. The Shia are not the threat. The Sunni are not the threat. It's the small proportion of those within those communities that are the threats. Now, the Iranians are 12er Shia. Now, it gets kind of complicated. I'm sure some of you know about this. Most of you probably don't. 12er Shia believe that there were 12 imams, which is different from an imam in Sunni, which is the guy who reads the khutbah on Friday. He's not a saint. The Shia have saints. The 12ers have 12 saints. In the end days, the 12th one comes back And it's a lot like Revelations, a lot like it. And then there are the fiver Shia, who you find in Oman, some in Yemen, and other places. And then you have the Abadis, or Abadis in Oman, different, closely Shia. And you have the Alawi in Syria, who actually, many of them celebrate Christmas and non-Muslim holidays. But they were written up in the holy city of Qom in Iran as a Shia sect because the Iranians needed the Syrians to help them in a conflict. So it all kind of boils down to you're a friend, your enemy, my enemy. And it gets even more complicated. It used to be you could figure out who the enemy was. Sometimes the enemy of your enemy is not your friend, it's just plain your enemy. And sometimes your enemy is your friend one day and then your enemy the other day. A slight aside, the Hunt brothers, anyone familiar with the Hunt brothers? Oil company guys, they try to monopolize the tin market. They built the oil industry in Yemen during a civil war. How did they do that? They gave stock certificates to the sheikhs. They became owners of Hunt Petroleum. During the daytime, some of the people protected the fields. At night, they attacked the fields. So who's your enemy? Who's your friend? I heard that there was a British embassy at one time in Yemen where the guards actually sometimes attacked the embassy. Long time ago. So, is this simple? And now we're doing this deal. I'm glad this is still working. This is good. I don't have to be yelling through this. This is an illusion. This whole thing is supposed to be finished in July. How many of you negotiated for a business? Okay, you're going to do this by July? A major merger of two major companies. This deal is simpler than the merging of two small grocery stores. Remember those before Walmart and all that? That would take weeks. An argument, lots of coffee, and for others, lots of beers. Figure out how to do this. 2-page document for this. This is going to open up so many things. I can warn, I can talk about it, and you know what? What I'm saying right here probably isn't going to make a bit of difference. Because I've been through this before. Before the Iraq War, I gave many speeches. I argued in many academic and other environments. I advised many people. This doesn't make any sense. This will be a disaster. And one person told me at the end of one of these meetings, Dr. Sullivan, the train is out of the station. You can't do anything about it. This was in 2002. The war started when? 2003. So, what's our grand strategic framework? What's our view of our future in the Middle East? I think it's pretty clear what the Iranians are up to, at least clear to me for now. Of course, that could change because conditions change. They want leverage and hegemony throughout the region and many other parts of the world. Many of them want to embarrass us or damage us. There are really two major parts of intelligence networks. One is non-kinetic, the other one is kinetic. Non-kinetic is just watching, waiting, trying to figure out what they're doing. Kinetic is you send these bad guys out and you do stuff to your people. That's not good. Are we going to allow them to fulfill their personal responsibility to develop hegemony in that region and others? Whereas we have allies in the region who are looking at us trying to figure out what we're up to. The United Arab Emirates is one of our tightest allies in the world. We have lots of agreements with them. And yet they're trying to figure out, what are we doing? Anyone familiar with the Tumb Islands? Tumb Islands were islands that the Emirates had and the Iranians took from them by force with military in the 1970s. I spent some time in one of their military hostels, otherwise known as a 10-star hotel. What a lovely place. And all of the rooms were named after one of those islands. They are bitter enemies with the Iranians. The Saudis help us on many things. They are allies to some degree, but it's kind of complicated. One of their princes, I heard, in a public meeting, state the following: if the Iranians get a bomb, we're going to get one. If we allow the Iranians to develop a nuclear system, it will nuclearize the Gulf. And even if we don't allow them to do it and we have a weak agreement, it will nuclearize the Gulf. This is not exactly a stable part of the world the last time I checked. The Saudis have a nuclear city already to look into nuclear power generation, and they brought in the Russians and the Chinese and the South Koreans to help them with it. Not us. The Emiratis have 2 nuclear power plants just south of Abu Dhabi being built by the South Koreans, not us. Now, add the following. We put a red line across Syria. Remember the red line? You cross that red line, something's going to happen. Try that with your kids someday, or your grandkids. You cross that red line, something's going to happen. If they cross the red line twice, they know it's not serious. We are not anymore in the U.S. Gulf hegemony. We are in a post-U.S. time. Post-U.S. For someone who's been around in the Middle East for a long time, that's sad to me. The Russians are back in Egypt. The Russians are going to be building nuclear power plants throughout the Middle East. How about that for turning the clock back in time? Another example of this red line and giving instability to our relations. You remember we cut off military aid to Egypt? We did, in the middle of a revolution with the Muslim Brotherhood blowing up things all over the country. We decided to cut off aid. The next day, my old friend Nabil Fahmy, their foreign minister, was in Moscow. I'm looking at this and saying, oh, I used to teach about the history of Egypt. This is exactly what we didn't want to happen. We had them thrown out during Sadat's time. What are they really up to? Warm water port, leverage in the region. So it's not just the Iranians we have to deal with. Look at this in the grand, big picture. Who is the major exporter to almost every Middle Eastern country? China, no longer the United States. Who is the biggest market for Iran, for Saudi Arabia, for the UAE, for most of the countries? China. China, Russia. Who was invited into Saudi Arabia to invest in the fields, whereas many American firms were not allowed? China. What leader visited the king of Saudi Arabia, Abdullah? Great leader, by the way, when you think about it. 4 times, whereas ours never even visited him in Riyadh, but once. We are in a competitive game here. We may still think we're in the 1950s or the 1970s. We are not. Our grand strategic vision has to be developed, and we have to understand the grand strategic visions of others in order to develop ours. Ever play 4D chess? No, because it doesn't exist. 3D chess, my son always beats me at it. See, you look through 3 different chessboards that are clear. You have to move and figure out how this whole thing works. Now imagine playing one of these games with the rules changing all the time. Welcome to strategic thinking in the 21st century. It's going to be complicated, and we need strategic thinkers. Name one. was giving a talk at Johns Hopkins, and I said, name a great strategic leader in this country today. And I told him, I'm going to go take a nap. How did that happen? We are in one of the most volatile, dangerous periods of history, whether we realize it or not. And we need great strategic thinkers, not politicians, out for their own good. If there's anything that any of us can do is pressure to have that happen. The Iranians have a grand strategic vision. I think it's pretty clear. There are changes on the edges. It will change over time. It will get more powerful as we allow it to. Where are the Churchills? Where are the Franklin Delano Roosevelts? Where are the Teddy Roosevelts? Where? Where are they? Anyone? That's what we need. I think I'll stop for questions now, because I could go on for the next 10 hours. You might imagine that one. Yep. I hope I didn't upset you too much. Yeah, you had a question?
Without a deal, will the sanctions fall apart?
It's already happening. The door is open. The Chinese yesterday made a deal for tankers. European businesses are raring to go, and our State Department, in all of its toughness, said, that's bad. The Turks are doing more deals. The longer this thing goes on, the more likely the sanction will be broken if the penalties for breaking those sanctions are seen as not being forceful enough. The SWIFT sanctions, if they're taken off, that's the end of the game. We can keep our sanctions, but if the UN multilateral sanctions are taken off, and there's a chance that's going to happen, unilateral sanctions do not work. I'll give you an example of that. We don't import any Iranian oil, right? We have sanctions against Iranian oil. Do you have toys from China in your houses, the houses of your grandchildren and your children? Yes, therefore you are importing Iranian oil, because that is made with Iranian oil. It's called virtual oil. Sanctions by one country almost never work. They have to be multilateral, worldwide, smart sanctions, and very tough to change behavior. Have we changed behavior? Castro's still there, isn't he? Yes, he is. Have we stopped the Iranian hegemony drive in the region with our sanctions? No. Have we stopped them from developing a nuclear facility? Actually, the Mujahideen al-Khalq, the people who actually talked about this in public, brought this whole thing forward and probably helped more than the sanctions did. Wow, now I'm really in trouble at my work. Yes. Can this be turned into something else? Cleverly, yes. In life, never is something as simple as you would like it to be. And you play the complexity. You don't fear the complexity. That's what we will need to do. But frankly, some of us are not so good at it.
Would you comment on the caliphate as part of a strategy?
Well, first of all, the so-called caliphate is not a caliphate at all. This is a fraudulent construction by criminals, murderers, drug runners, people smugglers, you name it. This is like the worst mafia family taking over the Vatican. That's not the way it works. Also, they're Sunni. And if the people in ISIS, quote, caliphate, ever saw some of the leadership of Iran within shooting distance, they take them out. This caliphate is breaking apart. Alhamdulillah. It's an Arab expression for thank God. It seems to be going in that direction because They've been losing some of their battles, and the worst thing you want to do when you have a bunch of criminals under your control is lose stuff, because then you lose credibility and they're out for themselves. How easy is it to control a whole bunch of people who think that the best way to fund a religious cause is by selling Captagon drugs to kids throughout the Middle East, or selling Yazidi women into prostitution? This is not Islam, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dar es-Shaitan. Translated from Arabic, the house of Satan. And that is the way we should talk about them, and that is the word we should use for them. As soon as we call them the caliphate, we give them credibility they do not deserve. Again, they're extremists and our extremists, feeding off each other. Our prejudices and their prejudices, feeding off each other. I don't want to see my children and grandchildren die because of a mistake.
What should be done?
What should be done right now? Ever painted yourself in the corner when you're trying to refurbish your house? Try to figure your way around there without getting your shoes wrecked? We painted ourselves in a corner. Not only that, we put glass on the ground, and we're not wearing shoes. How do we get out of this? It's good it's not signed. It's good there was no formal agreement. And it would be very good if they stretched this thing out, because the situation on the ground may change our ability to have a stronger position. Because Iran has a lot of frustrated kids too. This is being rushed. My dad used to tell me, and he was a lawyer, when things are rushed, something's wrong. He was almost always right. With that anyway, not with other stuff. But if we waited this out, unemployment, bad education system, oppression, imagine being 18 years old and being in an oppressive society when you have the ability to go on the satellite TV and the internet and learn about the rest of the world. And you're from a great culture that is completely contradicted by the culture that took you over in 1979. In Shia tradition, the mullahs should not be in charge of the country. It's against their tradition. The only time when there's a just government in Shia tradition is when the Mahdi returns, when that 12th Imam or 5th Imam returns. That hasn't happened. So this contradicts everything. The most pro-American youth in that region are the Iranians, because we hate their government and they hate it too. And there's hope there. We could wait it out too. What's the rush? There's something wrong here. I think it's called an election.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to end our session. This is one of those evenings that could go on for a long, long time. Thank you very much.